Hi, and welcome to my guide to the earliest science fiction films. In this video, I'll be covering movies from 1895 to 1909. Now, science fiction films have been around pretty much as long as the medium of film itself. The first movie is generally considered to be from 1888, and the first film we're going to talk about that has some science fiction themes is from 1895. The earliest film that really could be considered science fiction in any way, at least that I'm aware of, is a 50-second short called The Mechanical Butler. At least that's the English translation of the original French title. The premise is pretty simple. A butcher has some sort of fantastical machine that can convert a pig automatically just into sausages. However, when you see at least the version that we have today, it doesn't really seem like there's anything science fiction actually going on. It seems like the butcher is just a fake. So the movie's status as science fiction is kind of dubious, but it has, according to Wikipedia, been cited as the first sci-fi film at least once, and that was by Phil Hardy in the Overlooked Film Encyclopedia. And this was made by the Lumière brothers, who were incredibly influential French directors. If you know really anything about film history, I'm sure you've at least heard their name. The next possible contender for the title for science fiction film is a film called Goo Goo and the Automaton from 1897. Like the previous short, it's French and made by a pretty famous director. This time it was Georges Méliès, who was a definite cinematic pioneer in lots of ways, especially his groundbreaking work with special effects, and of course, special effects in science fiction often go hand in hand. Goo Goo and the Automaton is about a robot, and is supposedly the first film to feature one. A book called Things to Come, An Illustrated History of the Science Fiction Film, said that this may be the first true science fiction film. Sadly, the film is assumed to be lost as of now, as is kind of the case for many films of that era. Méliès also directed the next film I'll discuss, which is undoubtedly science fiction, and it's the one you're most often going to hear described as the first science fiction movie. Of course, I'm talking about A Trip to the Moon, or Le Voyage dans la Lune in the original French. As you may imagine, it's about astronauts taking a trip to the Earth's moon. They encounter these crazy-looking aliens there, and the film is the source of the famous image of the moon with the face getting hit by a spaceship, which I'm sure you've seen at some point. The plot is influenced by Jules Verne, as you may imagine. That's pretty common of any science fiction artists of the time. This is definitely the most well-known film from Méliès, and he also starred in the film. And it's actually really one of the most famous silent films in general. It was 13 minutes long, so this was his longest film yet, and probably his most complex. It took 3 months to film. Trip to the Moon is over the top, but this was intentional, and that's honestly a big part of what makes it so entertaining even to this day. Everything's real stylized and theatrical, which kind of makes sense because Méliès began his career in the theater. And fitting this theatrical style, each scene is played out in a wide shot and just has a stationary camera. There's no close-ups, no continuity editing. So when Méliès wanted to release the film in America, he actually was beaten to the punch by Thomas Edison's company, who secretly made basically pirated copies of it and showed it in the United States, which meant all the money for the United States showings went to Edison, not Méliès, and the film ended up being a huge hit. So the money from that probably would have helped Méliès out because he eventually had to declare bankruptcy. So, despite its popularity, A Trip to the Moon was actually also considered lost for a while, and even Méliès himself was somewhat forgotten until there was a resurgence of interest in his work in the late 20s. By 1930, there were 2 known copies of the movie, but they were both incomplete. It wasn't actually until 1997 that the movie was completely reconstructed. And they even luckily found a hand-colored print of the film in 2002. As a film about space travel, it's really the first film featuring what you'd consider classic science fiction themes. I would definitely consider it to be the first true sci-fi movie. Okay, so moving on, the next one to discuss is actually another Méliès film called The Impossible Voyage from 1904. It's similar to A Trip to the Moon in a lot of ways, and it could sort of be seen as a spiritual successor. It was actually a bit more ambitious than Trip to the Moon even was. It was almost twice as long at 20 minutes, and it cost 37,500 francs, which was the equivalent of $7,500 at the time, which is a pretty exorbitant cost for a movie. Like A Trip to the Moon, it saw some inspiration from Jules Verne. It was actually based on a play of his called Journey to the Impossible. And one more similarity that both films have is that they lacked intertitles, which is pretty common among silent films at the time. The plot for The Impossible Voyage involves a tour around the world, but they actually end up going into space even, and to the sun. And similar to how it is in A Trip to the Moon, everyone can just walk around on the surface of the sun totally fine. They don't have any spacesuits or anything, and they don't get killed or burned up. The final Méliès film I will mention is Under the Seas, which was 18 minutes long from 1907, and once again, inspired by Jules Verne, is actually parodying his novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It's set up as a dream of a fisherman, and it's got all these crazy sea creatures, nymphs, mermaids, giant seahorses. Apparently there's not really any plot elements or characters taken from the book, but it does involve, the fisherman is traveling by submarine, sees an underwater ballet, then he ends up crashing, gets stranded underwater, and he gets attacked by the sea creatures. And then the film cuts to the fisherman just waking up from his dream, and he turns out he's just caught in some nets. Okay, and then last we have a movie, a British film called The Airship Destroyer from 1909. It was 20 minutes long, directed by a guy named Walter R. Booth, who actually just 3 years earlier had made the first British animated film, which is called The Hand of the Artist. This movie, The Airship Destroyer, centers on a fictional attack on Britain by what was at the time, fantastical fleet of airships. So this was actually the first aerial warfare-themed film. It involves airships attacking an armored car, an airplane, destroying both of them, and even in a prophetic touch, the airships drop bombs on a city. The status of Airship Destroyer as science fiction is somewhat debatable, given that nothing in the film was too far away from what was possible at the time. It's really not that far from what ended up happening less than a decade later in World War I. However, given the relative lack of science fiction in this era, I thought it was worth mentioning. So it's also called The Battle of the Clouds. That's what it's listed as on IMDb. So if you want to look it up, you'll have to search for that. So thanks for listening, and hopefully part 2 will be coming soon about the sci-fi movies of the 1910s. So keep an eye out for that. Thanks.